Turning to tonight's entertainment item. Was it exploring tramways only accessible by boat? In the south of Victoria, north of Tasmania, Bass Strait. There's many islands down there. Some are too small to mention. Others are habitable. Some aren't habitable, but they have lighthouses on them, and there've been little tramways to service some of those lighthouses and other things. So well, now I hand over to Floyd Bromley, who will give us this presentation on exploring tramways only accessible by boat. Would you please give Floyd a wave to welcome him here?
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Floyd.
Let me just share my screen and we will get started. Just give me a sec.
Your background scenery is nice.
Yeah, thanks. All right. So yes, my title is Exploring Tramways Only Accessible by Boat, an Adventure to Deal Island. This is the scene of where we will be exploring today. So yeah, it's a lovely little bay in this area, and yeah, as Bill said, there's many islands around between Victoria and Tasmania, especially along this little stretch which Deal Island is a part of, and this particular one is both inhabitable and has a lighthouse and a tramway. So what more could you want in an island? Before I move on, I will just point out, if you can see my mouse, this boat over here on the far right, that's the boat that I sailed in on. And there was a few other boats as well while I was there as well. So yeah, the scope of this presentation is just sort of describing my journey, its goals, what my findings were of the tramways, and along the way I'll talk about the history of the island and the tramways, and just what my experience was when I was there on the island. I'll talk about whether it's possible to do a group tour there in the future, and any further research which I'd like to do. And yeah, here's another scene of the boats that were there. It changed a little bit in the 2 days or so, 2.5 days that I was there. So this is Sailing Alliance on the far right, which is the boat that I sailed in on. And I'd classify it as sort of a mid-sized boat. It's nice and spacious, but it's not gigantic either, and it's not too cramped. But yeah, you had quite a variety of boats that were there. You had everything from this little fishing vessel that I think he said he came from Welshpool, and a trailer sailor, which I think he also said he launched from Welshpool, all the way up to this big boat here, which is apparently he's got a private jetty on Sydney Harbour. So I don't know how much his boat is worth and how much his property is worth, but it's easily in the millions. But it's just a great example of how, although Deal Island is a place that is relatively unknown outside of the boating world, it is relatively known inside the boating world. And yeah, you get quite a variety of boats that turn up, which can be nice. So my total journey from Sandringham to Deal Island and back was 10 days. Left on the 27th of last year, of December, so almost a year ago today. And yes, spent New Year's on Deal Island, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and got back to Sandringham on the 5th of January. So my journey went as follows: started in Sandringham, stopped, we basically did day sails. The boat is perfectly capable of sailing overnight, but there was only myself and one other person, and we weren't in a race to get anywhere. So rather than getting sleep deprived with one of us having to be awake at all times, we decided to stop overnight at a few strategic spots. Phillip Island was not only just a good general length away from Sandringham, but also the boat that I sailed on actually has 3 owners. Paul was one of the owners that I was sailing with, but I know the other 2, and one of them has a holiday house in Phillip Island. That's Alex, and so Paul and myself went to visit Alex at his holiday house for dinner in Phillip Island. So that was nice and convenient, but we did sleep on the boat. Next day we went to Wilson's Prom and stopped over at Refuge Cove, which is a well-known place, especially in the marine world, and it was visited by many historic boats and expeditions that I won't go into. But yeah, we spent a couple of days there. I think we spent 2 nights, so one day, just having a rest at Wilson's Prom, despite the fact that you are not exactly doing a lot when you're sailing. It is quite exhausting. The boat is on autopilot most of the time, but still just the motion of the waves, you don't realise how much you're moving your muscles just to stay upright. So it can be quite exhausting, and the rest at Wilson's Prom was definitely well welcomed from both of us. Anyway, we left Wilson's Prom and went to Deal Island. In terms of just the length of hours of the day, I think Melbourne to Phillip Island was about 10 hours. Phillip Island to Wilson's Prom was about 9, and Wilson's Prom to Deal Island was about 6 hours. So decent length days, but yeah. We did go via Border Island, Border Islet, which I will speak about more in the next slide. But yeah, when we came back from Deal Island, we went to Wilson's Prom again, but the other side to Oberon Bay. The reason being that was favourable for the weather conditions. The first time we were at Deal Island at Wilson's Prom, the winds were blowing more from the west, and so we were protected from the land if we went on the east side. But then it was the opposite going back. The winds were coming from the eastern side, so if we were on the western side of Wilson's Prom, then we were protected by the land. Then back to Phillip Island, saw Alex again, and we were getting pretty tired at that point, so we weren't keen to go all the way back to Melbourne, or Sandringham rather. We made it back to Dramana and moored there for a night. Just, I don't think we even went ashore. We just pulled up to a buoy that we could sort of tie up to, and then spent the night there and went back to Sandringham. So this is Border Island. It's not a very impressive place. It's pretty rocky, as you can see, and yeah, it was just, you know, a top of what would have once been a mountain range all along from sort of Wilson's Prom to Tasmania. But the reason that this particular place is interesting and special is because it is the only land border between Victoria and Tasmania, and also consequently is the shortest border between any 2 states, or the shortest land border between any 2 states in Australia. And the reason why this border crosses this tiny island, it was actually never intended to. Originally, they surveyed the island to be a little bit further north from where it is, and they made that mistake. And when they were determining in the courts and in the law about exactly where the border between Victoria and Tasmania would be, they said, you know, we'll define it at this particular latitude, and then it was set in stone, and it was not intended to pass through any land areas because they didn't want any conflicts about who was looking after what part. But they later discovered that their original survey was inaccurate and that the island was further south than anticipated, and it cut right through the border. So to this day, it's jointly managed by Victoria and Tasmania, but it's not like either state really has to do much. And yeah, it's not really a place where you can easily pull up to in the boat. So we just sailed right past it, but it was a small diversion, probably added, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour to our journey in order to swing past it. So it could have been, say, a 5.5 hour journey to Deal Island, but it interested both Paul and myself from that perspective. So yeah, we both thought it was interesting, so the diversion was worth it for us. So yes, the vessel that we travelled in is Sailing Yacht Alliance, as I said. It's based out of Sandringham Yacht Club. I sail on this boat usually most Thursday nights. I skipped sailing tonight to make this presentation, but I also sometimes sail on Sundays. The boat usually goes out sort of 3 times a week with different owners depending on their availability. And I've been sailing for about 15 years now. I started on small little dinghies that could only fit sort of 1, maybe 2 people, and in recent years have become friends with the owners of this boat, and so pretty much sailed with this boat for the last 4 or 5 years, and been lucky enough to be invited to a few longer expeditions, this being one of them and my longest with them to date. So yeah, the trip had sort of originally been planned to go to the west coast of Tasmania, but long story short, a lot of people weren't available for that length of journey, and so we decided that it was going to be too ambitious for the 2 of us to go to the west coast of Tasmania, Paul and myself. But and especially since I didn't have any ocean experience. I had lots of experience sailing inside the bay, but not any experience sailing outside of the heads. So he said, okay, well, Deal somewhere sort of in the Bass Strait is good for a first time ocean sail, and just to see if it's something that I like to be on the boat for that length of time and not being able to get off necessarily for all day. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I never got properly seasick. I did feel a bit queasy at one stage during the first day, but thankfully that subsided. The captain of the boat, Paul, he was actually seasick, even though he has more ocean going experience than me. So that was interesting, but yeah, we both survived, and the weather was nice enough. And yeah, I was perfectly capable of handling the boat on my own in an emergency if needed. So, why did we decide to sail to Deal Island? Well, it was really just a point of interest and a good sort of length away. Paul had been there before and liked it and wanted to go back, and I'd heard about Deal Island both through my sailing world and through the Tramway world. I sort of knew that it existed. I'd seen a couple of photos, but didn't really know much about it. But yeah, we both decided that it would be a perfect destination. So yeah, going into it, I did ask on the Lighthouse Facebook group what was known about the island and what I should look to find out. And it was basically a few articles written on the web here or there, but not a whole lot. And so I basically said, okay, well, I'll go and just find out as much as I can. So yeah, Deal Island is part of the Kent group. It's a group of sort of 3 major islands and a bunch of smaller islands. This is East Cove, where we anchored our ship, our boat, and you can see the lighthouse is there, sort of about 3 kilometres from East Cove. The island, Deal Island itself, is about 5 kilometres wide and 6 kilometres tall. there's been various settlements on Erith, Dover, and Deal over the years. Northeast Island is a bit too rugged, and all the other ones are a bit too rugged to have any permanent settlement in recent times, in the past couple hundred years at least. But as I'll discuss later, there is now another lighthouse on Northeast Island. So yeah, the early history of Deal Island, there was obviously Aborigines. Bass Strait was originally not an ocean, as I'm sure many of you know. And even to this day, it's fairly shallow waters. It's only about 80 metres deep, which sounds deep in some respects, but then you realise that, you know, most of the rest of the ocean is several kilometres deep. So 80 metres is quite shallow. So yeah, Aborigines would have been on Deal Island before it was an island. And to some extent when it was an island, so post Bass Strait. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily permanently inhabited by Aborigines once it became an island. Europeans discovered it. It was discovered by Matthew Flinders in 1798. And yeah, since that time and into sort of the mid to late 1800s, there were a number of atrocities committed by Europeans towards the Aborigines, which I won't go into, but you can imagine things weren't necessarily pretty for them. Cattle grazing, there was official cattle grazing and not so official cattle grazing by various people over the years. And yeah, it was a common sort of shipping area. So there had already been a number of shipwrecks in the area by the 1840s before they decided that there was really a need for a lighthouse. And there was a series of lighthouses sort of stretching. Wilson's Prom was one, Deal Island was another. There was Goose Island and Flinders Island, I think, all had lighthouses. So the lighthouse was constructed in 1846 to 1848 to the design on the right side of the screen. No tramways were used for the initial construction. It was just bullock teams. It was constructed using local granite, bricks, all these bricks, shingles and rafters and limestone and joists. Everything else pretty much was imported. I'm sure they cut down a few trees to make the rafters and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't have any direct evidence of like a sawmill as such on the island, but there may have been some sort of makeshift sawmill used during construction and then dismantled afterwards. So yeah, as I said, it's about 3 kilometres from the landing site, sits 280 metres above sea level, and is touted to be the highest in the Southern Hemisphere, second highest in the world. And usually the whole idea of a lighthouse is to be tall so that it can be seen, but it was often plagued by low-lying clouds being, you know, relatively high up from the initial sea level. So it wasn't always the best to be that high. So yeah, made up by a few people. The crew: Charles Watson, overseer, medical dispenser, 2 carpenters, 2 masons, 2 quarrymen, 1 blacksmith, and 5 labourers, and of course 10 bullocks who were not paid in pounds, at least, to be on that project. But yeah, it just gives you an idea of their wages for the time. No convict labour was used. Different sources report different things, but the most reliable source that I could find specified that, in fact, no convict labour was used explicitly. But yeah, some ex-convicts and ticket of leave people, like, you know, they have committed they're not necessarily a convict, but sort of low security prison type men may have been employed. The light itself, which has a bit of a history. So on the right, you can see the original 1848 light source. There was 21 oil burning lenses that burned from the time that it was turned on in 1848 all the way up to 1891. And yeah, as I said, the high visibility with low cloud about 40% of the time, but Wilson's problem could see it 6 nights out of 10. So it was all right. It did its job and certainly prevented a few shipwrecks, I would say. So yeah, you can sort of see that you've got the seven lights made up here. It's based in 3 groups. I'm not sure if the original light source rotated at all. I don't think it did, just based on the mechanism. But yeah, or maybe it did. Yeah, there's really no distinct answer as to if it did or didn't. But there definitely was a revolving light source, which was burned between 1891 and 1921. It was again oil burning, and at that time in 1891, the lighthouse was shortened a bit to accommodate the new light and to hopefully improve visibility a bit. And that was the time that the tramway was constructed for the construction of the new light, and it continued to operate after that. So that oil source was replaced with an acetylene operated light that was just flashing in 1921. That was a big upgrade for them because they no longer had to haul such large supplies of oil up to the lighthouse. And yeah, burned until 1937, sorry, when it was replaced with an even better solution, an electric lamp with a Fresnel lens with a diesel-driven generator installed just near the base of the tower, and that went on to become the final light source, burning all the way up until the lighthouse closure in 1892. In 1987, however, 2 supplementary automated lighthouses were installed on the northeast and southwest islands in 1997, and AMSA said at the time that they were not intended to be the replacement. However, that comment was definitely seen as suspicious at the time, and it proved to be correct that they were intended for replacement because, yeah, in 1892 they decided that the main lighthouse would be turned off, but the 2 automated ones would continue. So yeah, the main lighthouse was decommissioned in 1992. So, settlement on Deal Island. Yeah, this is a historical picture pulled from the National Archives from the 1980s, I think 1987. There was various settlements in a couple of different places along over the years, but the main one was this East Cove settlement, which yeah, stayed for a long time, and even to this day, that's where the current caretakers of the island live. So yeah, there was the main settlement near East Cove and the jetty. There was assistant keepers' cottages built near the lighthouse, which got destroyed in a couple of bushfires, and a halfway house, as it was called, between the assistant keeper's cottage and the main settlement, which was destroyed in the 1955. And yeah, in both settlements, various buildings were sort of constructed and demolished as living conditions improved and as technology improved as well. Communication on Deal Island evolved quite a bit over the years. In the early days, flagging down a passing ship was your only way of communicating with the outside world, apart from the fortnightly supply ship, which was often unreliable. It wouldn't necessarily come every fortnight for various reasons. And so, yeah, the early keepers and assistants and whatever of Deal Island really had a tough life in those early days. Not only were they isolated, but yeah, food could become scarce and they would have to ration. Thankfully, this changed in 1926 when a wireless telephone was installed. So, flagging down ship lasted about 70 odd years, almost 80 years until the wireless telephone was installed. And it would have been a huge relief to the people living on the island to be able to finally communicate reliably with the outside world. There was definitely radio installed at some point. There's reports of there being HF radio, which makes a lot of sense. There's the way that radio works is basically the lower the frequency, the longer its range. And so even though HF stands for high frequency, it is a comparatively low frequency, and it will easily do sort of 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers, up to about sort of 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers, depending on atmospheric conditions. So it was a good long-range radio communicator, but HF requires a lot of power to operate, and so it's only really installed on larger vessels, and then even then only some larger vessels. A yacht the size of the one that I sailed on could have HF in today's world, but at the time that HF came in, it wouldn't really be practical. Most boats back in sort of from the 50s and 60s onwards up until the present day all have VHF pretty much. That sort of gives you 100 or 200 kilometres of range. And possibly they even got UHF radio, which is even higher frequency, goes from high frequency to very high to ultra high. And so shorter range, but again, UHF is a technology that could be carried on some boats. And I'm pretty sure they have UHF today. And yeah, they would have had other forms of radios, such as shortwave radio come in. Shortwave, as the signal can really reach worldwide. So shortwaves, it's not practical to transmit on shortwave for any sort of vessels or on the island, but definitely to listen in and know about current events and that sort of thing and news. The radio was brought in. There was the mail ship every fortnight, which also brought supplies. And yeah, pretty much as long as that was operating, food was available but could be scarce. And so a lot of the light keepers and assistants or whatever did grow their own veggies on the island. Standard TV also came in at one point, not sure exactly when, but being there on New Year's Eve, of course, we had to watch the fireworks, and there were no fireworks on the island itself, but we could watch the standard TV and see the fireworks in Melbourne and Sydney. Actually, being there on New Year's Eve, we were invited up to the caretaker's residence for a bit of a New Year's Eve party. They just had a bunch of friends over. It was pretty low key, but yeah, we appreciated the invite, and so we turned up with a bottle of wine, and it was all very jovial. And yeah, again, I don't know exactly when, but a 4G tower was installed at some point I know this because I accessed 4G on the island, particularly to download weather. It wasn't, you sort of had to be in the right spot. I'm pretty sure there's only one single tower or transmission point installed. There's definitely not a tower, but there's one 4G spot. But yeah, I'm not sure if there was ever 3G. I suspect not, just because with the way that 3G is being phased out at the moment, and many places, even in mainland, had to be upgraded straight from 3G to 4G or even 5G. I don't suspect that Deal Island ever had 3G. Yeah, as I said, supplies were scarce. A 50-gallon barrel of oil was reported to take 1 week to transport from the jetty to the lighthouse. This was claimed by the first lightkeeper in a letter to the government. I'm a little sceptical of that claim. It is only 3 kilometres, and even though, sure, the roads wouldn't have been that well formed back in the 1840s, I wouldn't think it would take a whole week to transport just 1 barrel. So I highly suspect that it may have taken a week to transport all of the barrels, and I suspect that the week also includes the time to actually unload them from the ship. It was quite a time-consuming process to unload a sailboat back in the day. So, yeah, once you consider a week between getting it all off the boat, getting it up to the lighthouse, getting it all unloaded at the lighthouse, a week seems reasonable for all the barrels of oil that were transported. Yeah, the families grew their own veggies, and yeah, basically the number of people on the island decreased as technology improved. There would have been about a dozen or more people on the island in the very early days in the 1840s into the sort of early 1900s. But then as the light needed less maintenance, it got down to, at the end, it was just 2 people living on the island full time. So yeah, this is the settlement on Deal Island at East Cove as it stands today. They are mainly powered by the solar panels, but they do have a backup generator as well. This building here was the original superintendent's cottage, and that's the current site of the museum on the island. But and yeah, the actual caretakers who rotate out every 6 months live in another house, which I didn't actually get a photo of. I was trying to respect their privacy, but also I should have found an opportunity to take a photo, so when they weren't necessarily in the picture. So yeah, that's something I'd like to do when I go back at least. Here's another view of East Cove, and you can see Erith and Dover Islands. Interestingly, this little stretch of land right here, it gets flooded, and so that's why these 2 land masses are considered 2 different islands, but at low tide you can walk from Erith to Dover Island and vice versa without touching the water. So it just goes to show you that it really is just the top of a mountain range. And there's one boat that you probably can't see off in the distance there, but boats do visit Erith and Dover Islands. They're less popular than Deal, but still popular enough. And this is the lighthouse itself as it stands in the current day. It is not accessible to the public. It was until about 2013, I believe. And then, yeah, it was deemed not safe, and so was the public were banned from accessing it. It pretty much hasn't received any actual maintenance since it was abandoned in 92. So I'd say it doesn't look in bad condition for a lighthouse that hasn't had much attention for 30 odd years. But yeah, it would be good for it to be accessible in the future. And I know that there is a group of people who are working towards that. This is the generator shed on the right and the path leading up to the lighthouse as well. This is the remains of one of the assistant lightkeepers' cottages. This was one of the earlier ones built in the 1840s, and it survived even after a few bushfires, of course, being made out of stone, but it's lost its roof long ago. But yeah, you can still make out the different rooms, so it's good to see. This building was the old oil store. I'm guessing that once oil had stopped being used, it was just used as a general storage room for a while, and then the roof probably caved in at one point, and they just decided not to repair it and store stuff in other places. This is a view from the 1930s of the lighthouse, and you can see one of the weatherboard buildings that was later destroyed in a bushfire. And I think that's the assistant keeper's cottage that you saw in the previous picture, and that's the oil store, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Heavy transport on Deal Island started with bullocks and horse and drays, which lasted for about 100 years in various forms. Even when the tramways were built in 1891 and operated until the 1950s, there was the two of them, and so they needed to transport goods from the top of one to the start of the other, and that's where the bullocks and horse drays came in. Four-wheel drives came in from the 50s and pretty much spelt the end of the tramways. The tramways were a lot of work to operate, so when you can just load it onto a four-wheel drive and drive it up the hill, yeah, that really made a big difference. And yeah, from the 70s onwards, they had newer models. I suspect that even post 1950 or whenever the Jeep was first introduced to the island, that the tramway may have been still used on occasion to supplement the four-wheel drive, but most of the heavy lifting, I'd say, would have been done by the four-wheel drive. And yeah, that's just a picture. That second picture is in the 1970s when they were installing new drains on the road. So other machinery was brought in around that point as well. From 1978 onwards, we upgraded again to a helicopter for the main delivery of supplies. That's when the fortnightly supply ship stopped and was replaced by the fortnightly helicopter delivery of mail and other heavy supplies. Came from Flinders Island, and yeah, while the helicopter was there, it might have been used to do some heavy lifting of other stuff as well. As I mentioned, there were two tramways. There's one which I will call the jetty tramway. It ran from the jetty to the top of the hill or near to it when the gradient sort of eased a bit. And then a bullock dray or a horse dray took it from the top of the tramway to the settlement at East Cove and then beyond to the second tramway. It was a 3-foot gauge tramway. That's one thing that was not known before my visit. I made sure to visit with the tape measure so that I could measure the gauge. 165 metres long approximately, with about a 1 in 2 maximum gradient. I know those things because I've got a GPS in my phone, of course, being a young person, and I managed to download a GPS tracking app where I could sort of tell it to start and stop, and I was able to record the data. So if anyone is particularly interested in that data, I'm happy to provide it. The second tramway is what I'll call the Lighthouse tramway. So it was from went from an intersection with the road up to the Lighthouse. Bullocks and horse trays were used to transport goods to the start, as I've mentioned. It was again 3-foot gauge, a bit longer, 245 metres, and less steep, about 1 in 5 maximum gradient. So yes, now we will go to this interactive map of mine, and we can see a bit more. So this map is accessible to the public. Anyone with the link can view it, and I think I might have made it searchable on Google as well. But it basically shows these 2 tramways that I've plotted, overlaid onto Google Maps from my data. If we zoom in first to the jetty one, you can see there's the settlement. It's in a nice fenced
Floyd,
facility. Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but we can't see the map.
Oh.
Is it sitting in a different window?
Yes, it is.
Okay, you might want to drop the share and hang on, see whether you can do more than one. Look, I would drop the share for the moment, then share your map.
Yep, hang on a sec. I will do that. Right, can you see that?
Yep, all good.
All right, so I'll zoom out again so you can get a bit of perspective. So yes, this is, as I said, overlaid on Google Maps, Erith, Dover and Deal. And this first tramway is the jetty tramway and the settlement compound. It's a bit of a fenced compound to keep the wildlife out a bit. They still manage to find their way in sometimes, but it keeps the majority of them out. And it's sort of the manicured area, if you like. So if I tick on that and that. So the blue is sort of my raw data, if you like. As I said, I had the GPS tracking. And so, yeah, I've sort of just drawn it and made notes of different points of interest along the way. None of it is terribly exciting. It's just about sort of when there's tracks starting and stopping and what pieces of rail exist in what places. But yeah, a fairly straight line. And I'll show that basically this was the top of the tramway here. So from what I could gather, sort of this line around here was the old road. The current footpath, I should say, sort of runs along this area, along this line. But I think the old bullock trade path was that way. That alignment seemed wider to me and less steep. And so I would imagine that it, sort of went up to the settlement like that. And it's a fairly logical direction to go as well. But for whatever reason, that alignment was abandoned by the time and was not reinstated by the time the tramway became of interest again, I guess. So then if you want to leave the compound and go towards Lighthouse, you follow this road out here and brings you into this forested area and up to the second tramway. Now, the length and exact starting point on this end, I'm not 100% sure on, but I'd say I'm sort of 90 to 95% sure that it ended where I've had it ended there. It wasn't obvious where exactly it ended because the start had sort of had a bit of earthworks over the years. But considering that the road existed before the tramway, I don't think that the road alignment was built over the tramway. And also you can see that the road sort of goes off at a different angle to the tramway. So although I think it might have been previously suspected that it went on for some distance on the road alignment, I suspect not. And the top of it, where the whim is over there. And yeah, you can sort of see my raw data. The blue line was sort of where I walked initially, and I seem to have turned the GPS tracking off, but managed to make a few points of where I found the rails. The jetty tramway was fairly easy because you could pretty much see the whole length, but this Lighthouse tramway was far more difficult to find. Sort of when you walk up along this road in the current day, you don't see the start. The only way you sort of would see the start is if you really knew what you were looking for. And at first I didn't. So I just sort of kept walking and went, okay, I'll just keep walking until I find something. And I found something around this bend here. It's a bit of a horseshoe bend, and you can see pretty clearly the rails. And so I sort of started there and firstly made my way uphill and found the top. And the top is obvious from the road as well. And then later on, I sort of went down and tried to trace it as far as I could going down. And because of the timing of when I was there, and we didn't actually know at the start how long we were going to be staying on the island. We'd initially planned for only about a day. And so I sort of came up there and didn't know what to expect, how hard it would be. But the light was fading, and so I decided that at the first attempt that I couldn't find any remains of the lower half of the tramway, but then ended up coming back the next day after convincing Paul to stay another day. He was quite happy to. I was definitely happy to. I said I had some more research to do. So I spent most of the day on my own, and he did his own thing. But yeah, I definitely found rails in the end, stretching pretty much the entire way. It was difficult to find it at some points, but yeah, it was mainly just buried under a lot of loose vegetation and that sort of thing. So I will switch back to the main presentation. I'm just going to find the window again now. Oh, I found it. Here we go. All right. So here we are, a few pictures of my explorations. This is, of course, the jetty, and you can see the tracks are still there along the way to the end. The tracks, as they stand today, do end sort of right where the bolts are, which is not quite the end of the jetty, but given the nail holes that I observed at the very end of the deck, I suspect that the rails did originally go all the way to the very end. It's only another distance of about sort of 2 meters or so, but yeah, 2 or 3 meters. But I thought it was interesting to note that they did go all the way. This is the only complete piece of rolling stock, certainly that is on the island that I know of, and pretty sure anywhere else. I'm not sure if it was always used on the jetty, but I can only assume so. I've got no idea if the other carts looked like this. There definitely would have been other carts, and I've got no idea really if what age this cart is or anything really, but it's just there. So a bit more research could be good to find out more about that. There definitely was a blacksmith shop on the island at some point, especially during the tramway operation, because there's reports of it being fixed, breaking and then being fixed by the blacksmith, and stories of sparks flying out of the blacksmith's shop and that sort of thing. This gives you another perspective with the jetty facing towards the land. You can see there's the trolley and the storage shed and the rails going all the way up the hill. Now, the rails as they stand are not in existence where you see this concrete at the end of the jetty up to the retaining wall. That would not have been there originally, and you can tell especially when I get to the few slides, I think. Yeah, so you can see the retaining walls used some lengths of rail to prop it up, and I'd assume that they came from the bit of tramway that was in this section. And there's a fair length of rails that are not existent on the jetty tramway. So as far as I can tell, I haven't sort of measured up all of the pieces and matched them exactly, but it seems in the right ballpark to me that no rail has ever left the site, and yeah, as far as I could tell, it's original rail as well. You can see here, that, yeah, the rails sort of end quite far up, and this length all the way down to the jetty would have been used to prop up the retaining wall. And yeah, that's just another view of the title slide. It looks quite tropical. It's not very tropical. I mean, it was definitely warm when I was there, but it's just the weather that you would expect for the Bass Strait, being a bit wild and unpredictable. But the water certainly looks nice from when I was there. That's a bit of a telegraph pole. There would have been some sort of bell communication, I would think, between the bottom and the top, to tell when to, when a cart was loaded and when to start hauling it up. You can see that sort of remains of the wheels, or whatever you want to call them, that the cable would have run across, the pillow blocks or whatever. Another view of them. And here we are at the top. This is the actual horse swim. So the horse would have been strapped in to here and walked around in a circle. As far as I could tell, it was anti-clockwise, the horse would move. And so that would mean that what would be, if you're facing down the hill, the left-hand side track would have been for pulling stuff up, and the right-hand side would have been for lowering carts down to counterbalance them. And yeah, is the timber and everything original? Who really knows? It was likely repaired over the years. I doubt that it's original timber from the 1840s. I just don't think it would survive that long. And new timber would have been easy enough to get. So yeah, but it's quite incredible that the whim still survives in its original location. And I believe that it is the only horse swim that is still surviving in its original location in Australia. Possibly even the world, but you never know. It's pretty rare to have it still in place, such an old piece of technology still in its original place. That's another view of the whim, and you can see this big lever here would have been for the brakes, just to lock it off and control speed if you if you had stuff just going downhill without any counterbalance or anything like that. It's pretty hard to see, but there is a pathway up in here, which is the current way that people access the lighthouse and the settlement and all of that when they anchor their boat on East Cove. So here's a picture of the WIM in operation. There's a horse strapped in, and yeah, it's working. There's not a lot of photos of it in operation, but there's a few that you can come across from a few different places. This was the jetty, the Lighthouse Tramway. This was the point at which I said that I first found the tracks. They were in a pretty obvious clearing. Having said that, I mean, obvious to someone who is on the lookout for tracks, I guess, but perhaps not so obvious to someone who isn't, because Paul told me that he had in his previous expedition to Deal Island, even the jetty, he actually said to me that he had no idea that Deal Island had tramways at all, and he's not a railway enthusiast or a tramway enthusiast or anything like that, but he's appreciative of that sort of thing, and that's certainly something that he would like to see. So yeah, for him not to notice either, well, I guess it can be missed if you don't know what you're looking for, if you're not specifically on the lookout. That's looking uphill from the point at which you see, and yeah, a bit of a rock formation bed there. This is the remains of the WIM at the top of the Lighthouse Tramway, obviously in a lot poorer state than the jetty one. It would have been a pretty similar setup, but yeah, this one has been left to decay for a lot longer. And yeah, as you can see, so the rails were often quite hidden underneath vegetation and that sort of thing. So hard to see. Right here, this is the end of the tracks. You can just see a single rail there, and there's another single rail sort of over there. But yeah, that's the lower extent of rails as they are today. Over here is the roadway. I highly suspect that the tracks would have gone all the way down to the bottom originally, but they were cut back at some point, not really sure when. This, I don't know if this sort of area was a deliberate cutting or whether that was just when they put the new drain in the road in the 70s, whether this is just sort of eroded over time more naturally as water has flowed down. This is it's fairly low resolution image from the National Archives. I did try to request a higher resolution copy, but apparently they had technical issues and I was only actually able to order it today. So they said somewhere between now and 30 days time, I'll get a higher resolution digital copy. So I'll share that to the Facebook group when I eventually get it. But I really wanted to include this image, not only because it has a good view of, you know, the assistant keepers' cottages and that sort of thing, but right here, you can make out, if your screen is big enough, that is the WIM. That's the horse WIM, and it, yeah, it's a 1917 photo, so the tramway was definitely still in use then. Would have been used for a number of years after that, and as far as I can tell, sort of that's the direction that it went down, and yeah, it makes sense to me. I think the exact roadway up to the lighthouse has changed a bit over the years, especially since various fires have ravaged the area. And there was another fire, I think, in 1996 when the island wasn't inhabited anymore and the lighthouse wasn't operating. But yeah, so there's far fewer trees in that area now than there once were. But yeah, you can see that the tramway was there. So although I said, yeah, that the trolley on the jetty was the only remaining piece of complete rolling stock, this was the only other thing, a wheel set that I found. That's just beside the museum. And yeah, there is possibly some other pieces of equipment hidden in the bushes somewhere, but as far as I could tell, this is the only other remaining piece of rolling stock. Where the others went, who knows? Unusual tramway cargo. A plane was once transported on the tramway. In 1933, it was a DeSoutter 2. It was flying a commercial flight actually from Flinders Island back to Melbourne, and they had some engine troubles, and so they decided that instead of, even though apparently he had the gliding range to get to Wilson's Prom at the time, the pilot decided to turn back and go to Deal Island, and had a bit of a crash landing, not a very bad one. I don't believe that the pilot or his passenger were injured, at least in any major way. They seem to have walked away from it. I don't think any of the people in the photo are the pilot. I think they're just all people who are either families that were living on the Lighthouse, on the island, or I believe one of them is a local fisherman. But yeah, the plane was dismantled and taken in pieces down the tramway because the landing gear had been damaged, and so it had to be transported back to Melbourne by ship. But yeah, provided a pretty unique opportunity to transport a plane down the tramway. And yeah, there's another part of the plane, and there's the wings. This shed is definitely no longer in existence. I'm assuming this is East Cove because, well, firstly, there's no sheds existing on any other cove of the island as far as I'm aware. But also that's where the ship was coming to, so it's the logical place to be putting down the wing. Not sure what happened to this building or what its original purpose ever was. Definitely something for the future to research. And yeah, here's a photo of the plane flying, that exact same plane. And interestingly, you can still see this plane today. It has remarkably survived not only its crash landing on Deal Island, but yeah, through various means, it survived into the current day and is on display at the Moorabbin Air Museum. So if you want to see a bit of Deal Island history and don't want to travel or don't have the means to travel all the way to Deal Island, perhaps Moorabbin Air Museum is worth a visit. Because, yeah, this plane was on Deal Island at one stage. Deal Island today, there's as I said before, there's caretakers, volunteer caretakers that are on 6 monthly rotations. You basically apply to the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service, who manage the island today, to be a caretaker on the island for 6 months. They will usually take 2 people at a time, and apparently there is a 3-year waiting list to be on it. So it's quite popular. And although it would be, of course, more isolated than living on the mainland, it's certainly far less isolated living there today than it once was, because you've got all kinds of modern internet and other communication, and yeah, boat traffic is quite regular, so you certainly get a bit of a social life as well. But yeah, if you can see in this photo, there's quite a bit to see. There's the jetty down there and the tracks going up the hill. Difficult to see, but they are there. There's the lighthouse up on top of the hill. This hill there looks like it's taller than the lighthouse, but it's not. It's just closer. This bluff there, so a bit of perspective. And of course the main settlement there. So yeah, that's a bit of an evening view of East Cove. And yeah, basically, if we were ever to consider a future group tour, it's possible in theory, but the logistics would be quite difficult. A boat the size of Alliance, which you can see again just here with our anchor light on. Naughty other boats down here and here don't have their anchor lights on. You should have a light at the very top of your mast to indicate to other boats that you're anchored. But I think they did turn it on later in the evening when it got proper dark. But yeah, possible options. I mean, Alliance, for that length of journey, even if you picked up in Welshpool and went there for the day, you're not looking at more than sort of 10 people, if that. You'd really want even less than that, and you'd want the weather to be damn good, and it would be a lot to organise for a private boat like that. A fishing charter, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who did a fishing charter and was willing to, or based out of Welshpool. That would be the logical the logical sort of starting point, I guess. But yeah, possible, I guess, depending on the size of the fishing boat, depends how many people you can take. Or another option could be chartering a historic boat such as the tall ship Enterprise. Again, you could probably, depending on how you managed it, sort of 10 to 20 people maybe, but all of these options are expensive. You can't fly there, although there is an airstrip, but it's not in the best condition, and so it's only used to transport the caretakers on and off the island and deliver supplies that are, I believe, once a month at the moment. But yeah, there's various options, but yeah, it's honestly probably not realistic unless there was very strong support and people were willing to pay quite a high price. So unfortunately, I think that to be realistic, the only time that I'm going to go there or anyone else is going to go there is just because they know someone and they go on a private expedition. Yeah, a piece of future research, I'd really like to find out the exact location of the halfway house. It's always described as being, roughly halfway between the lighthouse and the jetty, but exactly where it is, somewhere along the road, not sure. I would think that with a bit more research into, I'll say that the museum on the island had quite a good amount of research material in it. It was surprising to me how there was not that much information published about Gill Island online, but there was loads and loads and loads on the island. And even when you do a basic search of like the National Archives and that sort of thing, there's not a whole lot. But you could read like annual reports and that sort of thing and probably find the location of the halfway house. Yeah, as I said, I'm not 100% sure the exact length of the Lighthouse Tramway. I'm pretty sure, but not 100% sure. And so if I could find a a report or something which gave me a length, then I could be more sure of exactly where it ended. Yeah, the second light source I'd like to find some more details on as well. It was mentioned in a reliable source, and so I included it, and it made sense about, with a few other reports that I was reading about exactly when the tramway was constructed. But yeah, I don't have many details about exactly the details of what it was and how it operated, so it'd be good to find that out. I suspect that won't be too difficult a task as well. I'd like to find out a few more details of the vehicles that were on the island, like an exact date that the four-wheel drive arrived and any other vehicles that may have come and gone over the years. Just a nice to know type thing. And yeah, any sort of further details of dates of when the tramway operated. I suspect that would strongly correlate with when the four-wheel drive arrived, but yeah, you never know. Reports of the time could probably answer that. And yeah, although the plane was the only sort of unique cargo that I know of, I'm sure there may have been other unique cargo over the years. So reading through reports could answer that. And yeah, the location of the quarry, the only mention of there ever being a quarry was just the fact that when it was the lighthouse was constructed, they used the local granite, which makes sense. But there was no obvious place for a quarry. So yeah, I'd like to sort of find that out if possible. You could honestly talk about Deal Island for weeks. It's got a surprisingly rich history for such a small and relatively unknown place. But yeah, just some things that I didn't mention. This was a proper plane crash. This was a bit later in the 1940s during World War II that a plane crashed, and all the crew, I think there were 2 crew members on the plane. They both were killed in the impact. I think it was a bomber that crashed. Makes sense with the big engines. And yeah, there were a few shipwrecks over the years, some more spectacular than others. One fairly famous one, which was Keratane, which sank just not too far from where this photo was taken. This photo was sort of near the lighthouse. If you walk down the path a bit, if you continue walking down the path, which I didn't have time for, you'll eventually get to a bay area where the wreck of the ship does become visible at low tide. So that would be good to have a look at another time as well. But yeah, there's just so much history to the island. Oh yeah, so here's yeah, so some more information on the Erith and Dover Islands. I sort of just touched on them, but they've got their own history, not quite as extensive as Deal Island, but still, there was graziers and holidays and different things. Bit of a history of electricity on the island would be nice to find out as well. I didn't really mention any history of that. There was grazing of cattle and sheep on the island, both for commercial purposes and just for survival of the families. I didn't talk about cooking wood-fired pizza on the island, but that is something that I did on New Year's Day. I've got a little portable wood-fired pizza oven that I brought on the boat, and I managed to transport it to the land and cooked pizza. Not something I would do again, just from the hassle factor, but hey, it was a cool thing to do. And yeah, didn't talk about the museum much, but it was established and there's lots of information there. Friends of the Island Deal Islands group they are the group that is currently sort of does regular working bees on the island and that sort of thing. And they bring in a bunch of people. I don't know exactly how they operate, but yeah, I might like to get in touch with them one day and see what more I can find. So yeah, just there's my references, and thank you very much. It's such a rich place.
Thank you, Floyd. That was interesting. Deal Island's not a place that I've thought too much about, and I'd never thought about tramways. Yeah, imagine there was a lighthouse or two around the place, but yeah, tramways serving them. It's quite interesting. But as you said, the place has got its own history for those who are interested in it. Would anybody like to ask Floyd some questions?
So, Bill, it's Mike. Just an interesting. First of all, congratulations on that, Floyd. I found it absolutely fascinating. It was really, really good. And just as one bit of feedback, the number of participants remained constant over virtually the whole presentation, and that's not normal. Normally they drop off a bit. So you've held people's interest very, very well. So thank you. It was a really good presentation. But my question is, you mentioned that there was fencing around the settlement there to keep the local animal population at bay. What is the local animal population on an island that's so isolated?
Good question. There's kangaroos and wallabies. I think I featured a photo of a kangaroo. There's a few different species of birds. Rabbits were introduced to the island. I don't think that they're introduced for any sort of pest control like they were for the rest of Australia. I think it was just a bit of a food source for the people living on the island, and a bit of interest as well, especially in the early days being so isolated. You know, anyone that turned anything unusual, anything out of the everyday was interesting, and so they would have spent a bit of time hunting the rabbits on the island just for the pure fun of it. But yeah, there's some wombats on the island. Yeah, there is snakes on the island. I didn't see any snakes, thankfully, but I was warned of them. And yeah, there's just, I think the island it's small, but it's not too small, so that, you know, for animals there can be a population that has sort of existed. They would have originally got there when it wasn't an island, and have just pretty much had a sustained population that's more or less, you know, what do I call it, like self-regulated over the years.
I would have thought it'd be an interesting place for people who study animals, given that population has been isolated for so long.
Yes,
Yeah,
I believe
how they've evolved compared to, say, on the mainland or on Tasmania.
Yeah, absolutely, and I believe that there has been a bit of study going on from animal researchers, and that there is a noticeable genetic difference between the species that exist on Deal Island and the species that exist on mainland Tasmania, or even Flinders Island, for example. Yeah, so I don't know too much about that research, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, Floyd, it's Bill here again. The horse-operated whims are interesting because they've been used in many places. And I remember many years ago travelling in New Zealand, and there was a lighthouse there that had this tramway with the whim at the top that tramway went from the jetty and up to the lighthouse. And when it wasn't in use, the horses just sort of roamed around near the lighthouse. But whenever the supply boat turned up, the horses went missing. So the lighthouse keeper had to go around and find his horses to be able to haul his stuff up the hill. I wonder if they had any problems like that on Deal Island.
Yeah, there's a lot of reports that existed on the island that I really didn't have time to read. I just sort of skimmed through a few of them. I don't remember reading anything like that, but yeah, I would think that the horses were probably just kept in the settlement compound. It's a reasonably large area, so they'd have a bit of space to roam there while still being available for use when needed.
Yeah, fair enough. Any other questions? You've done a good job there, Floyd.
Actually, it's me again. Bill, once I click the button
fine.
here, I've got another one. I saw a grave in one of those photos
Yes.
that you had there, Floyd. What's the story behind that?
Oh, good question. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. I did read about it. I think that was somebody who was living and working on the island, and it's quite an old grave. I believe, just from memory, it's over 100 years old. I'll see if I can flick back through to it. I think I know where it is.
The top of the tramway incline.
That's right.
Background.
Yes.
On the right hand side of the image.
Yes, I do. I do remember. So once I get to it. Right. There we go.
There we are. Yeah.
Yes, so I can read it from my screen. The name is Rakamia Jackson, 9th of February 1881 to 25th of February 1881. Sorry for both dates. So that's an infant death.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know there's a few graves on Deal Island. There's one near the top of the jetty tramway. That's a longer lived person. But yeah, there's a few graves. There's definitely a few graves on Deal Island. Some are marked and some are unmarked. And I do believe that there is somebody at least who has done a bit of research into the specifically the graves on Deal Island. And I think, well, I mean, you can see that the wood on that grave is, and the writing is fairly modern. So I think the cross would have been a recent addition, but the grave was probably just surrounded in stones or something like that. So with that one at least, you could call it a marked grave. But yeah, I know that there are definitely more accounts of people having died on Deal Island than there are known graves. Put it that way.
Okay, thank you.
And I know that at least the original lightkeeper, Charles Bordenay, he died on Deal Island? I'm actually not entirely sure about that. He definitely died while he was lightkeeper, but he may have died either in Melbourne or on the way back to Melbourne. But yeah, I know he was buried in Melbourne. He wasn't buried on the island.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
What was the supply boat, Floyd? Did you come across its name, the one into the more modern era, the fortnightly supply boat?
Well, the fortnightly supply boat, it changed over the years. I did come across a name. I don't think I recorded it, or at least I thought to record it, or didn't, or whatever. So yeah, that's one thing I'd like to compile as well is names of supply vessels. I came across. I know the last supply vessel was a fairly modern ship, but that was sort of used in conjunction with the helicopter. But I believe up until 1978, there was a ketch which did the fortnightly supply run. And yeah, I mean, just in for those who don't know much about boats, a ketch is a type of boat. It's a type of sailboat that has two masts and sort of two main sails, and they were very common for cargo sailing vessels and sort of just general purpose sailing vessels, just due to their ease of handling and practicality. And actually, a lot of ketches would use their boom as a crane. So the boom is part of what holds the sail. But when you take the sail down, when you'd arrive in port, you would use the ropes and pulleys that you'd use to normally hoist your sails. You'd sort of rig them up in a different way and rig your boom up in a different way, and the boom could sort of swing. It's often designed to swing 360 degrees to pull stuff in, put stuff in and out of the cargo hold. So, yeah.
That could then be May Queen, which is preserved in Hobart statically. And there's another one that's operational, running out of one of the northern ports, not as a tourist venture now, not running cargo at all.
I don't remember hearing that name, so off the top of my head, I'll say no, that's not the supply ketch. But
we also had Lighthouse tender vehicles, which would be logical for delivering supplies to Deal. One of them was used to rush rescue equipment for the Mount Lyell disaster. It was the Victorian government workboat. And I think Waiuna was a Lighthouse tender as well, and it's survived. It's modern, relatively modern.
Yeah, well, I know that the supply boat was dedicated. It was a Lighthouse tender. Because it would make the journey. I believe it went from Welshpool to Flinders Island on sort of a 2-week round trip, where it would do a run from Welshpool, stop over at Deal Island, Goose Island and Flinders Island to resupply all of the lighthouses, and then make its way back to Melbourne to pick up more supplies. And that would run on a 2-week rotation roughly. But of course the weather greatly affected that. So
Floyd, it's Andrew Dalton calling. There was another vessel, the Cape Pillar, used to regularly service a lot of the lighthouse installations around Tasmania and Victoria. But if anybody's interested, there's another book that was put out by John Cook. It's a memoir, and it's titled The Last Lighthouse Keeper. And he spent a lot of time on Tasman Island and down on Matsyker Island. Well, Tasman Island is really an extreme condition that you wouldn't want to go and live there. It's worth reading his book just to see the deprivations and the really extreme hardships that those people had to endure to keep the lighthouse service going. And I would highly recommend anybody interested in the tramways from there, and also the jetties and tramways at Matsyker Island. It's worth having a look into that book, Last Lighthouse Keeper by John Cook. Anyway, that's my 2 bobs worth.
Yeah, again, the name doesn't ring a bell. I do distinctly remember reading a name for a supply vessel, so I'm not sure if that one never had any part, but the name doesn't ring a bell. But a funny story that if I go to the plane, a funny story about the plane was a recount from the pilot who seemed pretty unfazed by the actual crash landing. I mean, planes in the 1930s were not the most reliable things to begin with, and you know they were very loud, noisy, rough. It would have been. I mean, I'll just say that having visited a few air museums, one thing that they really like to present to you is like today we think of flying and flying in economy as more of a chore and like we do it because it gets us to where we want to go quickly, but it's not something we necessarily seek out. But in the early days, flying was the experience, and so it didn't really matter how basic the amenities were, flying was the experience. But the pilot said something interesting. He said that the worst part of the experience in his mind was the trip back to Melbourne on a 30-foot fishing vessel, where the plane went on a different boat, I believe, but he went back on just a 30-foot fishing vessel. And he said it was the most terrifying experience of his whole life, and he would sooner be in the air any day of the week.
I've read something on the UPR crash. I think it was one of the young Hollymans. It was either Hollyman was in that crashed vehicle or Hollymans came to the rescue. They ran Bass Strait Shipping and started ANA. And I've got something in one of my aviation magazines.
Right.
Scott Cloud here. Preceding the Cape Pillar, there was the Cape York, and she was very much old-fashioned when she was first built. I can remember who used to come into Hobart to have a bit of a rest from the sea, I suppose. But as you said, the Cape Pillar came along later.
Now, that's interesting you say that, because Cape York is the one that does ring a bell, actually. So it's possible the Cape York supplied Deal Island at one point.
I think probably the Cape York used to supply lighthouses all around the southeastern part of Australia.
Right.
You would never go to sea in it.
Yeah. All right. Has anybody got anything else they'd like to ask? Okay. Floyd, you might like to close your presentation.
All right.
There you go, so we can see a few more faces. Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, as I said earlier, very interesting. Not a place I'd thought a great deal about, but I had heard of sailors on middling-sized yachts, sort of going using that as a stopping off point and that. But no, very interesting.
Well, I know of at least one other member in this group tonight that has visited. Roderick Smith himself has visited the island on sailing ship Enterprise.
Yeah. No, Rod's been everywhere.
Yes.
Haven't you, Rod?
Yeah. And in fact, if I charm my way, I could probably get back to Deal in a couple of weeks' time. Anybody who has a large wooden boat that's taking it to Hobart Wooden Boat Festival is likely to call by Deal, because it's a popular staging point, not for fueling or anything, just to get out of the weather or just to have a nice picnic on the way through.
Yeah. They may even drop you off there, Rod.
Yes, I've got to come back. Yeah, and that was part of the logistics for our own light railway. You'd have to go with enough supplies to wait out for the weather.
Oh, absolutely.
Even
Yeah,
if you flew in,
yeah, yeah.
we flew in.
Good stuff.
We certainly we had excess supplies on our boat. We knew the weather and we knew how long it would take us to get back, and we thought even if we're delayed for a few more days, we're going to have more than enough supplies. So we did offer the caretakers to donate some supplies to them, and they accepted a couple of things from us, and other things they said, "Oh no, we've got plenty of them." Especially we actually mainly supplied them non-perishables. They said that was the thing that they were really lacking, was non-perishables, because they got lots of perishable supplies from all the random people that dropped by in their various sailing adventures.
Yeah, yeah. No, Bass Strait at the best of times can be a bit nerve-wracking. That having sailed in a few of the Gippsland Lakes Marley Point overnight yacht races and hit by storms down there, I'd hate to have been out in Bass Strait. Yeah.
I've just managed to open up the chat and saw Bob Stonehouse asked if there's any possibility of the system being restored to working order as both a historical project and a visitor attraction. Oh, look, anything is possible. The main hurdles, I think, to that is mainly just volunteer resources. It's hard enough to operate tourist railways on the mainland, let alone a remote island. So realistically, no, I don't see that happening. But is it possible? Sure, in the sense that anything is possible.
Yeah, it's true.
Floyd, one question that's been asked is what's the water source on the island, drinkable water source?
Oh, good question. I think it's mainly just rainwater capture and processing of that. I don't think there's any sort of desalination on the island, but yeah, I don't entirely know actually. So good question.
Okay, and Rod also asked earlier on, was it whale oil that was being used, or what sort of oil was being used for the lighthouse?
Good question. Again, I'm not entirely sure. I think it was just sort of a standard fuel oil type thing that was used in whatever applications of the era. Yeah, and was just transported in oil drums.